collecting data from the Apple Podcasts app? Is Live365 back? And can podcasts be profitable?
Welcome to the Richard Daly Podcast, bringing you a UK perspective on the latest news and developments from the world of podcasting and internet radio.
Welcome to episode 15. Last week, Australian company Omni Studio announced that an upgrade to its audience measurement technology now includes data from the Apple Podcasts app. As part of a webinar about podcasting metrics that was co-hosted by Omni Studio and Rain News, Omni said that they think this is the first time that such measurement technology has been introduced. Now, Omni Studio didn't say much about how their technology works during the webinar, but it must interact, I guess, somehow with the Apple Podcasts app. Now, we know that Apple doesn't release any information on downloads, or indeed any of the other listening statistics that you would think would be available from Apple. So the question is, how are Omni Studio doing this? Omni Studio said that they can get an approximate understanding of verified plays, skips and drop-off points for podcasts from a previously untrackable sample of Apple Podcast listeners. And apparently they're able to get statistics for about 30% of the Apple Podcast listens. So is this really a game changer? Well, we know that about 80% of all podcast listening happens through the Apple Podcast app. So being able to track 30% of that is actually a pretty big sample. Now, of course, the issue might be which podcasts can this technology actually track? I mean, let's say, for example, that somehow they're able to see data from audio recorded on one particular application, let's say like Adobe Audition. That's just an example. You know, I've no evidence or thought that that's actually what's happening, just using it as an example. So this might mean that a particular type of podcast is being tracked, i.e. podcasts being recorded using Adobe Audition. Now, this, of course, will be podcasts where the producers are prepared to pay money for software to record their podcasts. So would that mean that the sample isn't representative? I'm sure that Omni Studio will release more information on their methodology over time, and I'm sure also that other companies will be looking to release similar tools as soon as they can. For now, if you want to check this out, you might want to sign up for Omni Studio. Plans start at $9 per month, and there is a free plan available for light users, so you can check it out at no cost. Can podcasts turn a profit? That's the title of an article by Rory Cellan-Jones, a BBC technology correspondent. The article discusses a UK podcast called Untold, the Daniel Morgan Murder, which has been a bit of a hit this year in the UK. Untold tells the story of the unsolved 1987 killing of a private detective, which apparently involved allegations of corruption amongst lots of police officers and newspapers. Now, the creator of Untold, Peter Jukes, raised £10,000 through crowdfunding and spent about 6 months putting together a 10-episode series of the podcast. Jukes teamed up with Acast to get the podcast hosted, and they were able to find a suitable sponsor for his show. The article goes on to discuss the tailoring of adverts in what Acast calls dynamic advertising, which means different listeners may hear different adverts, and those adverts might change over time. It also means adverts can be changed for previous shows, which I think is pretty powerful. Acast is also seeing success with paid content. The article uses another UK podcast called The Football Ramble as an example of this. The weekly episodes of this show are free, but once a month they release a paid programme as well. In the article, Peter Jukes tells the author that Untold isn't planning to use the paid model, and actually says his motive in producing the podcast was not commercial, but that he wanted to get a story out that nobody in the mainstream media was prepared to talk about. Jukes says that once he asked a lecture hall full of students how many of them read a daily newspaper. Now, this is interesting. 3 in the audience said yes. But when he asked them how many listened to podcasts, about 70% of them raised their hands. Mark Ramsey this week interviewed RD15. They, of course, host his podcast. He concluded that podcasting is going to be big business and that the growth we've seen to date is going to accelerate as the industry transforms and more advertising dollars become available. Mark notes that a key theme that came out of his interview with Art19 is that the metrics of podcasting, the listener behaviours that are measurable and measured, are changing fast. Now, as I've mentioned before on this podcast, Mark and many others see the biggest obstacle to growth of podcasting for business being advertisers lacking the metrics that they want and indeed expect from a mass media platform. I'll let you listen to the interview. It's just under 20 minutes long and let you draw your own conclusions. There are some great takeaways in my opinion, and as always, Mark is a great interviewer. You can find the audio recording on Mark's blog at markramseymedia.com. And of course, there'll be a link in the show notes to this episode at richarddaly.com/15. An interesting new concept now from the US. I'll be honest, it did take me a while to find out exactly where in the US this is happening, but the company PRX has launched the Podcast Garage in a place called Allston. Now, apparently Allston is in Boston, Massachusetts, but the website, that's podcastgarage.org, doesn't actually seem to list the full address anywhere. Now, maybe it's a well-known place for Americans. If so, do let me know what Allston is famous for. Now, I'm not sure, but perhaps it's most famous for Harvard University. That's the only thing I could find on the internet, which I believe is located there. So what is Podcast Garage? Well, Podcast Garage is a multi-room community podcast recording studio. For about $60 an hour, anyone can reserve time in what is effectively a fully equipped recording studio that's also equipped with the appropriate hardware and software to edit podcasts. Now, PRX see this as a space for independent podcast producers to gather, collaborate and record their own podcasts. Now, I have to say, I think this is a great idea. I do wonder if there will be enough podcasters willing to pay for this type of service in the UK for this to work here as a standalone business. I'm guessing probably not at this time. Maybe in a city like London there would be. But perhaps an enterprising co-working space owner could look to include one or more recording studios within their office spaces. What do you think might be an interesting idea to pursue? If you hear a noise on the recording, now that might be me pausing this recording to go out and buy a related domain name. Now, an article now from a newspaper called the Star Tribune in the US. This is an article by Kevin Berger. Star Tribune is a Minneapolis newspaper. This is a nice feel-good article which talks about how local people are starting their own podcasts. Now, the first podcast introduced in the article is by a husband and wife team who present a podcast about life and birdwatching called Bird Chick. This husband and wife are just one team of many new podcasters who are sharing their passions with the world through podcasting. The article notes that these hobby podcasters, as they call them, typically use inexpensive microphones but are changing what, where and how people listen to audio through the use of stories and opinion pieces. The author, Berger, quotes a Professor Laura Gurak from the University of Minnesota who said, "No longer are people simply media consumers. Now more of them want to be media makers." Now, of course, we probably all are media makers using Facebook, Instagram and Snapchat already. Another podcast mentioned is the Geek to Geek podcast hosted by Andrew Nielsen. Geek to Geek is an hour-long conversation about gaming, movies and technology and has about 900 subscribers. Nielsen says that what attracted him to podcasting was there were no barriers to entry. No one had to give him permission to start. Now, like many podcasters, Nielsen relies on word of mouth to promote his program. That and the fact that many podcasts focus on niche topics limits potential commercial sponsorship, of course. Amateur producers tend to regard podcasting as a hobby rather than an income stream, at least according to the article. Berger spoke to a media buyer who said that until now she has declined pitches from podcasters looking for commercial support as there aren't enough listeners to provide value to sponsors. Now, this is something we hear a lot about in the fact that you need to get to a critical mass of listeners before you can attract sponsors, and I hear the number 5,000 per episode typically mentioned. Now, I think this is a great article. It's the kind of article that will attract new podcasters. I have to say I love this one. Now, if you've listened to this podcast for any length of time, you'll know that I don't aim to tell you how to podcast, but I do enjoy the technology involved, so I will try and mention interesting pieces of equipment and software occasionally. A company well known for producing quality recording equipment is Tascam. Tascam have just released a pair of small soundboards designed specifically for podcasters. So you might be asking, Richard, what is a soundboard? Basically, it's another name for a mixing console or mixer, but it usually has a few built-in features that make them particularly useful for radio, or, in this case, of course, podcasting. The Mini Studio is a device designed to recreate a radio studio on a small scale at home, specifically for podcasting purposes. And there are two versions of this Mini Studio from Tascam. Both are Windows and Mac compatible. They connect to your computer via USB, which means they could, of course, also be connected to iOS devices using the Apple Camera Kit. The Mini Studios can record audio quality up to 24-bit 96 kHz and will work with various different recording software packages. There are 3 built-in pads that can be hit to trigger sound effects, and there is a built-in voice effect feature. The US 32 model costs $130. It has only one microphone input, or you can go for the US 42 model, which has 2 mic inputs, as well as also providing multiple headphone jacks and a connection for studio monitors. Pretty good value, this one. The US 42 is only another $50 at $180. Both models have built-in compression features and allow instruments to be connected. Now, this is where it gets interesting for me. I think these devices might well work well for DJs broadcasting online, but this isn't something I've seen tried yet. Neither model is available in the UK as yet, and they aren't even in Amazon.com. I think I'll be trying out one though as soon as they're available, so if I do get hold of one, I will do a review on a future podcast episode. Watch out for that. A quick piece of news from online training site Udemy now. Scott Payton, who previously produced the podcasting course Podcast Made Easy, has just released a new course called Podcast in the Classroom, Kindergarten to High School. This is aimed at teachers, so if this might be of interest to you, head on over to Udemy. A link in the show notes, of course, richarddally.com/15. At the moment, the course is available at half price for just $20, and Scott does some great training. I went through his initial course, Podcast Made Easy, and it is really good. From the Rain News blog this week comes news that Live365, the internet radio host which shut down suddenly in January 2016, might be reopening. It looks like the assets of Live365 have been sold, and that plans are being made by the new owners to relaunch the site. This is potentially great news for the many small internet radio stations that have been struggling to find an affordable home since the Live365 site shut down. But of course, as Brad Hill of Rain News points out in the article, it's not clear yet what form the new version of Live365 will take. By this, I mean, will it offer the same services and business model as before? And if so, how will the new owners make it economically viable? The old owners clearly thought that was not possible. Since Live365 closed down, many small internet radio stations have also shut down. Others have moved to sites like Radionomy and Stream Licensing, where some of them have found good homes, but others have been hit by the restrictions that those sites impose themselves. Let's wait and see what happens, but on the surface this seems like it could be great news for people running small internet-based radio stations. An interesting development from BBC Radio in the UK now. The BBC station Radio 5 Live has cancelled a long-running show about non-league football. That's soccer, of course, if you're in the US. But rather than stopping the show altogether, it's been announced that the show will continue now as a podcast. The podcast will continue with the same presenter, Caroline Barker, and will now be hosted on Audio Boom. In fact, it turns out Audio Boom will be jointly funding the show with the existing production company, that's Jibber Jabber. It looks like the show has been a victim of the current round of cuts being made by the BBC as they look to save money. But it's good to see the show continuing. It's been running for 10 years in one form or another already. I'll end the episode this week as usual with the Where Can You Meet Me feature. I'm planning to be at the September Fizzle meetup in London on the 6th of September. On the 15th of September, I'm attending a podcasting micro-conference which is being run by the Institute for Learning, Innovation and Development. That's at the University of Southampton. This event promises to reveal the secrets of producing professional quality podcasts on a limited budget and aims to cover the entire podcasting process for beginners and is clearly aimed mostly at the university audience. Unfortunately, the conference is sold out now. They're also looking to provide at the conference tips on presenting and interviewing, as well as advice on how to engage with online communities so that you can build a buzz for your podcast. Mike and Isabella Russell of UK Podcasters, New Media Europe and Music Radio Creative are both lined up as guest speakers, as is Kevin Field. Kevin is the host of the excellent podcast Radio Skills for Podcasters. I'll also be at James Quidland's next radio conference on the 19th of September in London. It's the UK's biggest radio conference. Tickets are only £149 plus VAT, so it's a pretty affordable day out. If you're attending, do let me know. You can tweet me at Richard Daly or email me at richard@richarddally.com, and maybe we can meet up on the day. Hopefully I'll also be at Rain Summit Europe in London on Wednesday the 2nd of November. Just waiting now for tickets to be announced for that one. I attended that event last year. It's a great event covering a wide range of topics related to internet radio and online audio. Plus it allows for some great networking opportunities during the breaks and at the evening reception. Okay, so that's all from the Richard Daly podcast for this week. If you visit my website at richarddally.com, you'll be able to find all my social media links, as well as the various ways you can subscribe to the show. The show notes for this episode are at richarddally.com/15. Do send me your questions or comments, and if there is a topic you'd like me to cover, then please tweet me. Thank you for listening, and I'll see you on the next episode.